All right, today I want to talk about some of the background in France leading up to the French Revolution. One of the first things we need to clarify, I suppose, is the three estates. The three estates. Now, what you really need to remember about the three estates is that the three estates has to do with the government of France, I guess you might say, the politics of France. But it's also the society of France. All of France, at least from a political mindset, was divided into three groups that they called the estates. And when they needed to call a meeting to sort of make a decision, which, by the way, the king never really wanted to happen, very rarely, because he didn't like getting these people together, he would have to call a meeting of the three estates. So let's take a look at the three estates. The third estate, let's start with the third estate. You might think maybe we should make it the third thing we talk about, since it is the third. But since the third estate is well over 90% of the population, then I suppose we should, estimates are probably about 98% of the population, we're the third estate. Okay. Now, if you're thinking of nobility and peasants, that's not a bad way to think about this as well. Peasants are the third estate. Nobility are the first two estates. The nobility is divided into two groups. The first group is the clergy. The second group is the nobility, it's called. But I mean, really, the upper clergy all comes from the noble class. So. All right, so who are the third estate? The third estate is made up of anyone who is not clergy or nobility, I guess to make it clear. And by clergy, I mean the upper clergy. I mean bishops, cardinals, that sort of thing. You might be able to, but even parish priests, they were really, the low-level priests were kind of out of this political realm. And they were much more identified with the people. Anyway, you can divide then the third estate into three groups. So you might say, well, it's just three groups. Well, actually, now I'm going to tell you that there are three groups, but the third group you could divide into three groups. So how many groups is that? This is a math question now.
6, 8. Yeah, sort of.
Well, no, it's more like 5. But anyway, that's all right. And I guess if you count this whole category as one, then we might have 6. But anyway, this isn't a math class, so we'll just move on. The first category of this, and really understanding that the third estate is not homogeneous, is critical to understanding the French Revolution. So it might seem like all the stuff I say is just, doesn't really relate to anything we're doing. And I admit, on occasion, it does not. But in this, at least, it does relate. Because the nobility, the clergy, the first two estates, I think we're still seeing the third estate as being homogeneous. They thought they were all the same. All the peasants, all the third estate are alike. Now, they may have recognized there maybe were some that were not as offensive as others or something to them. But you really need to get this in your head, is that the third estate was not everything the same. At the top of this group, I number them number 1. These are just my numbers. Nobody calls it by that. But they do call it by this, the bourgeois, or the bourgeoisie. The bourgeois, then, we might call today the middle class. Nobody called it the middle class then. I just use that label because that helps us, in our way of thinking, to understand who these people are. Okay? These are people who are trained. These are people who are educated to some degree. These are people who become business owners. These are people that actually become pretty wealthy because they are running business.
They're kind of upper middle class.
Yeah. And, yeah, and again, when you use the term middle class, it can be, it's kind of like that liberal and conservative thing. It can mean different things. You know, when I turn on the news, it'll say, well, you know, like for example, this tax cut is for the middle class, or then other people say, no, this is going to hurt the middle class. And sometimes I wonder, what is the definition of the middle class? But I don't want to get too sidetracked in that. That is a floating definition by some. But the point here is that we don't just have upper class and lower class. There is another group that's very important. We'll call it the middle class. We will define it in French Revolution terms as people who are business owners, people who are gaining wealth. But here's the thing, they don't have any power. They don't have any political power. They don't really have much power in society, except that they've got this money. So they have some influence. And in fact, some of the upper class need to borrow money from them from time to time because, you know, they're running out of money. Why is that? The upper class did not want to get involved in business in any way. Why? Because if you're nobility, you don't work. This is an idea you got to get in your mind. For them, it was unacceptable really to work. Now you could have a position, you could have an office, which I suppose would require you certain duties, but you did not work. You didn't go out in the field and shovel or plow or something or plant. No, you didn't, and you were not a merchant. Merchant's barely above a field hand. I mean, you know, like you're going to actually like sell people things and take their money and stock shelves or something. I mean, you know, we just don't do that. Why? Because we are nobility. You don't do that. Now, again, for us living in, I guess what is now the 21st century, that seems very strange to us because most of our icons, whatever you want to call them, idols, are all people who have soiled themselves in business a long time ago and they've made a lot of money, and that's where they get their power. But that was not the way it was then, although it was beginning to shift that way. So again, just estimating the population is very difficult, but let me just make a round number. Let's say roughly about 50,000 people were in this middle class, we'll call it, or bourgeois, business owners and that sort of thing. The second group were often called the proletariat. The proletariat. And of course, I know you're up on all your Marxism because I can see it in your eyes when I say that word, how they sparkle and shine with the very thoughts of the words of Karl Marx. So, you know, he didn't make up these words. What I'm saying is he used them and he kind of redefined them in some ways. Well, proletariat means a worker. Karl Marx, you know, it's about everybody. But by this definition, I mean proletariat are workers, but these are primarily peasants that live in urban areas. Urban peasants. So you got to divide urban peasants from rural peasants, which are agricultural workers. Why is that? Well, because that's going to be by far the biggest group, will be peasants who work in agriculture, production of food, taking care of animals, plowing fields, all that kind of harvesting. Okay? And also the thing is, you got to remember, very different, I want to say needs or situation. Because, you know, if you live out in the country and you're basically working on a farm and you're not as worried about, what do we call it today? Food sourcing? Is that the word? I don't know. They make up their word. Where's your food going to come from? If you live in the city, you are totally dependent upon food being grown out in the country, and not only being grown out in the country and harvested out in the country, but then shipped to you in the city. If any part of that breaks down, you don't have food, right? So the grain has got to be ground into flour, and the flour's got to make it to the baker, and the baker's got to bake the bread, and you got to get to the bakery to get the bread. Or you don't have any bread. You're not going to do it yourself because you don't have any wheat. You don't have any chickens. You don't have any pigs or whatever. You don't have anything. So that means that the food supply is disrupted. You go hungry, and you go hungry pretty fast. Because, they don't have deep freeze or refrigerators or stuff like what we're accustomed to, all this prepackaged food. And you could stock up, like I know many of you have bunkers, and you have 5 years supply of whatever, Doritos and Spam. Spam will last a lot longer than Doritos, by the way, just in case you're wondering. And cans of water or whatever you got down there in your bunker. Cans of water. You don't want it in bottles. The bottles, the plastic will leach into it, and then it'll. Oh, you want canned water. Really, it's much better. It'll last a lot longer. Anyway, not those plus those plastic bottles break and they don't store well. I mean, if you're keeping them there for 20 years, you're going to want to, right. So, anyway, what I'm saying is they get worried about their food supply. And that's about 2.5 million people. So just to give you a ratio, here it's like 2%, which is in the thousands, maybe about the size of the bourgeois. Yeah. Then you got the bourgeois. Then you got the proletariat. Now take a look at this, though. The peasants. 22.5 million are what I will just label as peasants, or we might call them rural agricultural workers. But that seems too long, right? Rural agricultural workers. RAW! R-A-W, rural agricultural workers. Well, anyway, 87% of the population are these peasants who live out in the fields, because the economy of France was set up as an agricultural economy, really. I mean, that's the real basis of it. Raising grapes, raising sheep, raising wheat, maybe some barley, keeping chickens and sheep and cows, and having dairies and so forth. All that kind of stuff. That's what falls into this area. Proletariat or city workers, those would be the people who do the manual labor in the city. Those would be the people who would work for the guys in the first category here, the guys who have a business of some kind. Maybe some tradesmen in here, like blacksmiths and stuff like that. It's hard work. And then the bourgeois. Now, this is the wealthiest of these, and these are the ones who've actually been able to get their businesses started and do it. And I'll just give you a little spoiler alert. If you want to know how the French Revolution gets started, in my opinion, and I think a lot of people's opinion, it's not really as Karl Marx might let you know. It's these people, the third group. It's really this first group that gets the French Revolution going. And the fact that the nobility and the clergy do not recognize these three groups, or if some of them do recognize it, they don't care, or whatever. The fact you can't treat all of these people the same, because they're not. And this first group, although let's say it's roughly 50,000 people, that's just a rough estimate. They've got a lot more power and influence because they've got a lot more money. And in fact, some of these top 2% are actually borrowing money from Group 1 in our peasant class down here, our third estate. And the problem is, these people, the middle class, the bourgeois, have no political say. They have no political power. They cannot influence any of the laws or anything. So they have a business, but then their business becomes...
Useless, kind of?
What's that?
Like useless for change? Or?
Yeah, maybe not completely useless, but they get bound up with regulations or the lack of
only operate in the guidelines
change.
set by the nobility.
What's that?
They can only operate in the guidelines set by the nobility.
Yes, this group up here, this 2% sets the rule for everybody else. These other people are far more complacent, like especially the third group. In part because you know what? Unlike the peasants out in the countryside, aren't that worried about starving. There's a lot of food all around them. If you want to get right down to it, they can, if they don't own a chicken, they can get a hold of one, if you know what I'm saying. And fry it up or whatever, make some chicken soup. They can get a hold of some grain. They can get some carrots or something. You know, I mean, they can get some things because it's all around them. If they get, you know, I'm not saying they had a lot to eat, but I'm just saying they didn't have to worry about the source. And once that gets disrupted, these people in the city get very desperate very quickly because they don't really have a way to store food, and they don't have a way to grow food or raise food or keep it. So they're very dependent upon that chain of flow. Okay, so let's take a look then at each one of these groups in whatever time we got left. So what is this first group of the third estate? As I've already kind of described this, the bourgeois. These are the rich who really wanted to be noble, or they certainly wanted to have, maybe not, you know, but they certainly wanted to have clout. They wanted to be able to influence the rules, the laws, the government, and they certainly did not identify themselves with those other members of the third estate, right? Because they were in a very different situation. Very different situation. A lot of these were the ones who were shopkeepers, so they had their own business. They were making money.
Were there a lot of
Hindus?
Hindus?
No? No? You're thinking of like modern shopkeepers in Europe or something, or Hindus?
I'm just, I know it's weird to like
Yeah.
think that, but just by the way that they like value the class system.
Oh, you're talking about like the caste system in India. Well, yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying. Well, this all grew out of the medieval society. Medieval society was, and really Roman society, very class-oriented. Romans, if you were upper, like a nobility in Romans, you did not associate with peasants at all. Medieval times, same sort of thing. This is why, for example, in early, like say in Rome, why Christianity was so radical, is that it basically said everybody's equal, everybody's the same, and that everybody's your brother and your sister and that sort of thing. So that you had peasants and slaves even going to a rich guy's house for church, or, you know, for meetings. And that was just, nobody understood that, nobody liked that in general Roman society. They were very suspicious of that. So where did this start? It didn't really come, you know, like out of...
I didn't think it came from it, but I just thought maybe with
Yeah.
the culture came like if you're used to that kind of a culture, then you might relate. Like your mind would understand the caste system.
And I think, you know, I don't know if it's not identical to the caste system, but this class system was pretty rigid. But it started that way really in ancient times. In ancient times, and then right up through medieval. So that, you know, what had happened, what had evolved up in Europe at this time, or just prior to this time, is that you had nobility, that's before the French Revolution, had nobility, this very small percentage of people who ran everything. They had all the privileges, they had all the land, and land was really wealth at that point. Land was wealth. And if you controlled the land, you had the wealth. And they had all the land. And so if you wanted to do anything, you were controlled. If you wanted to make a living farming, well, you didn't have any land. So you're going to have to, quote unquote, rent the land. You're going to have to pay to use the land. You pay it by your labor, and you give the landowner a big part of what you harvest. And you keep a very small portion, some to feed your family, some that you could try to sell. And so that kind of system then also worked into a system of privileges for the nobility. For example, let's just say you raised wheat. And let's say you got 50 bushels of wheat. All right, maybe you wouldn't get that much, but let's say you did, 50 bushels of wheat. You're probably going to have to give about 35 to 40 of that to the landowner. So that means you're going to have 10 to 15 bushels. Let's say your family's going to need 5 or 10 of those to live, and then maybe you could sell 5 or 10. But let's say you wanted to make your wheat, as most people would want to do, into bread. You've got to grind it into wheat into flour. It was illegal for you to have your own way to grind it. you had to take your wheat then to the miller, the guy who would mill your grain into flour. And guess what? Guess who controlled that? The nobility. And then you had to give them a percentage of your flour to get your stuff done. So, I don't know, let's say 20%. So if you go there with 10 bushels and you get it ground into wheat, you're going to give them at least 2 to 3 of those for that. So that means you end up with even less. And if you had got your own millstone and tried to do some of it at home and they found out about it, you got in big trouble. If you tried to go out hunting and get some animals to eat, you got in big trouble because the lord, the nobility owned all the land. They owned all the animals, all the wild animals, the rabbits, the deer especially, big game, but even the small things like birds and rabbits. So, I mean, you were really locked in, really locked in. When things begin to start to change is when some of the trade opens up and some opportunities open up to have business, and the people in the nobility see no reason to do that. That was beneath them. And so some of these peasants began to run those businesses. They actually began to make money. So they improved themselves, their lives, but they had not changed that old system where they had no power. The only power they had was the fact they had money and they could live a better life. But they really wanted to improve their situation. They were the ones that were the most dissatisfied, I guess is what I'm saying. They were the most dissatisfied with their situation, and they had the most to gain by it changing. I suppose, maybe the wisest thing, and looking back on it, if you wanted to just save lives and conflict, if the nobility had said to those 50,000 people, you are now nobility, and you get to work in your shops and make your money that way. I mean, I don't know if that would have solved it, but that would have saved a lot of problems, right, for them. But when push came to shove, when they could have listened to them, they did not. There's our spoiler alert. They did not. The king did not want to hear from these people. The nobility did not want to hear from these people. They didn't want to hear from any of this third estate. And they didn't recognize that this smaller group in the third estate had a lot of power. So you had shopkeepers, you had artisans, people that would be goldsmith, silversmith, blacksmith, bakers, people that had a trade where they actually had a shop and they were making money selling things. Also, people like lawyers, people that who basically were finding a way to make money through being employed, helping people negotiate laws, right, as much as possible. Minor bureaucrats, like you sort of work in the government of the local, let's say duke or whatever, and but you're not nobility, but you have some power because you're connected and so forth. And here's another key thing. Like I told you, the most wealthy of this group of bourgeois were actually loaning money, at this case in France, to the king, because the king was running out of money. That's exactly why the king is going to be forced to call a meeting of the third estate, is that he needs money. He needs more money to run his government and to get himself out of let's call it an economic pickle.
They were in a war debt. They had lost the 7 Years' War, then they lost the Bulk.
Yes.
No, and then they joined in our War of Independence.
Yes.
They won, but they spent so much money.
Well, yeah, but we won, but they didn't really win. I mean, in other words, they helped us win basically to punish the British, but they didn't really get much out of that. They didn't get anything out of that.
Well, they humiliated the British Empire. It's pretty much good enough for
The
them.
British sort of gave them a good one too. The British really showed them up. They just really lost here. They lost here. They won everywhere else.
Nah, the French Armada absolutely destroyed their expeditionary force at Chesapeake.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. They lost here in the Americas, but the British won just about everywhere else.
Yes. Well, at the end of the 7 Years' War, the British are definitely in charge. And you get to the Revolutionary War of the United States, then yes, the British lose out there. like you said, they're in control everywhere else. And bottom line for what we're talking about is France, even though France helped to, I don't say humiliate, but give the British a bad time, it didn't really end up financially anyway helping the French. They didn't get, there wasn't a whole lot of plus side on that, and there was a lot of expense because they really helped fund a lot of what we did. So basically, the French government was in debt. The king personally was in debt. And where did he go to get the money? He's going to the bourgeois. These are the people that have money that he can borrow. And so he is. So, and so he's not that willing to give these people even more power. I mean, if he doesn't like the fact that he owes them money, I suppose. Usually you don't like owing people, well, maybe some people do, I don't know.
The borrower is a slave to the lender.
So, the next, according to Wealth, successful lawyers. Then we might put merchants and industrialists. But what their main goal was trying to improve their lot in society. In essence, they wanted to try to become noble or nobility, which, of course, you have to remember, in medieval Europe and in this period of France, you cannot become nobility. You are born nobility. But this is what they are hoping. This is what they are hoping that they can do. Like I said, if at this, before this thing broke out, if there would have been something to say, hey, you know, we're going to let you become nobility, even if it was a little lower level nobility, I think that might have appeased these people and avoided some of it. So the middle class, bourgeois, are the ones that are really going to steer the revolution into its radical stages of bloodshed and overthrowing, spoiler alert, getting rid of the king altogether. And I guess we're going to have to leave that for next time because I think we're out of time. All right.